Welcome to Being Human. I'm one of your hosts, Steve Cuss.
I'm co-hosting Lisa Cuss.
On Being Human, we help you pay attention to the dynamics that get in the way of healthy relationships. Of course, you naturally think of your people, but actually there's also dynamics that kind of block your awareness of God. And maybe most powerfully, we help you notice the dynamics that set you off from being well with yourself. So what we focus on is being human-sized. And once in a while, Lisa and I jump on the mics together and we kind of recap the last several set of guests. So before we do that, let me light our candle for us. Every time on our episode, whether you're joining us on video or audio, we always pause and we light a candle because it seems like every week we all have something going on that makes us forget the Lord. And we just pause and remember God. Relax into God's presence and remember that we're not alone. Okay, Mrs. Cuss, before we get into our guests, how's it been being married to a shingle-infested man?
I was not expecting that question.
Uh,
Honestly, I have really felt for you.
mhm.
For our listeners, Steve had shingles that had attacked two nerves on the face.
Yeah.
And so, which is supposed to be one of the most painful forms. I think all forms of shingles are painful.
I don't know.
Yeah. But it went into your gums, it went
Mhm.
into your ear.
Yeah.
Like you thought you had ear infection. Then you thought you had to have a tooth extracted just because of the level of pain. So I think what it felt like was just like really hard to watch you be on a journey of embracing a relationship with pain that was going to last 5 weeks. And there
Yeah.
wasn't really anything I could do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought shingles, I got shingles, 5 weeks ago, and I
Yeah.
thought it would last 5 or 8 days. And the pain, most of the pain is behind me, although sometimes it still shows up. But yeah, it's been a interesting 4 or 5 weeks around the Cuss house.
We had to cancel several things just because the look of it.
Yeah, I was not looking great. I
Yeah.
still look a little bit like a teenager
Oh,
with
I
my
don't think
kind
so.
of pockmarks on
Yep.
my face. Yeah. Recently, we did a marriage conference with our friends Glenn and Holly Packiam at their church, Rock Harbor.
Yeah, and Costa Mesa. Yeah, such, I don't know. I feel like we go to these places and it's like, I want to join your church. When you get into vulnerability, it just becomes such an invitation. So yeah, it's really
Yeah.
beautiful.
One of the gauntlet questions I ask every guest in this part of the season is, what's something that the local church offers you can't get anywhere else? And I feel like every time we travel to a church, we see the local church in action in so many
Yeah.
beautiful ways.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah.
And the gift of coming alongside, I think when you can see that with people interacting and sharing and caring and carrying some, it's really beautiful.
Yeah. Okay, so we have had 4 guests since you and I were last on. Let me name them. We'll just go through
Mhm.
one by one, and we're just going to pull out a couple of themes from each episode for the last month, just to help us kind of deepen our integration. And so we had Zach Meerkreeps, we had Kathleen Smith, we had Eugene Cho, we had Steve Carter. Let's start with Zach Meerkreeps. Let's talk about him. What do you reckon?
Um, I mean, I remember the first time that you received an email from him and his story. And I think what sticks out to me just about him as a human is what a easygoing guy and a guy who is so like enamored. I think you used the word
Bewildered, yeah.
by God, but is so low key and just does not want to get in the way of anything that God is doing. Yeah, so his whole story of just how the outpouring began and dealing with his own sabotage after a sermon that he did not think went well.
I can so relate to that. I've had so many of those, except there has not been an outpouring breakout after my bad sermons.
That we know of. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So sometimes people will reach out and they want maybe just some time or some advice or something. And it's not uncommon that I will Zoom someone and really not know anything about them. It's kind of like a blind date Zoom where they're wanting some anxiety management tools or something. And yeah, it was last year. I couldn't wait for you to get home to tell you about it. I open up my Zoom and there's some guy named Zach. I don't know anything about him. And I
Yeah.
ask him a little bit about himself. And he just very quietly says, "Oh, I'm a doctoral student at Asbury." And I say, "Asbury?
Were
That's
you
where
there
the,
for that?
yeah, were you there for the outpouring, and he quite sheepishly said, "Oh yeah, it was my sermon that launched it." And that kind of brings us to one of his great themes and his book,
Mhm.
Humility. But there was a phrase that really caught you in that of what Zach was talking about.
Yeah, he's on one hand bewildered by what God was doing, and we'll go more into what the outpouring kind of looked like,
Mm,
um but he used the word wanting to remain sober to what the Lord was doing, and wanting to not be identified with the credit of God, but to more be a participant in it. Um, and even talked about the leadership, I think, from Asbury. Like there were times where they just didn't even mention their last names. So they weren't credited with what was going on, but made it just gave me a picture of like, what can we do to decrease so that what God is doing increases and people see him? And it was just, yeah, it's just a beautiful, his disposition with it is just a really good reminder.
yeah, because he really could have become quite famous through
Oh,
this as the kind of so-called guy who launched the revival. But even he mentioned like the president of Asbury wouldn't introduce himself as president, just gave
yes.
his first
First
name.
name only to
They
be a
just
participant as
yeah.
well.
And it
Yeah.
was like 80,000 people in I think it was 13 days came to Asbury to
And it
experience it.
and it started with a group of 19. Um, Yeah, and then he was just saying that being able to see the repentance, being able to see, the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, and then just the tech like, from 19, just texts, like, inviting more people to come, like, "You can't believe what we're experiencing here." It just was a natural, but because of technology, like, quick
Um,
spread, just really beautiful.
yeah. I asked Zach, what was some of the evidence of the outpouring? I loved his answer when he said the evidence was the fruit of the Spirit.
Yeah.
The evidence was the way students and people were treating each other. Feels like a timely message in our anxious days.
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Yes, it does, especially now, right? Like,
Yeah.
how are we going to treat it? Like, how do we even create an environment? What are we doing in ourselves, in us, in between us? What are we putting out into the world where it could be even an environment where an outpouring like this could take off?
Yeah.
It's a really good question to ask.
Yeah. Yeah. Talking to Zach kind of reminded me, I can't believe we get to do this, have this podcast.
Yeah.
Like, it's really a treat that we get to meet these people and hear what God's been doing in their life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's an encouragement for sure.
Yeah. Our second guest was Kathleen Smith. Kathleen is one of our favorite systems theory teachers. She had just released a book called True to You. And Kathleen and I got into the topic of differentiation, one of my favorite topics. Okay, so she defined differentiation as being inside the relationship, but outside the patterns. I found that helpful. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I actually really like that, because I'm an attachment person.
Indeed.
And I think inside the relationship, it bids its head to how do we put healthy boundaries and notice how we're relating, but for the purpose of being able to connect
Yeah.
in the relationship? And how do we look at our processes and our patterns rather than just the same content for the purpose of connection?
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually really liked it.
Yeah, I think it was really, I'd never heard that definition before for
Yeah.
differentiation. And the thing that I thought would be helpful for today's episode, when I heard her say, okay, differentiation is being inside the relationship, but outside the patterns, part of me thought to myself, yes. And also, there are healthy patterns that are worth celebrating. So I do think for our audience, you could be considering this week, okay, what are some really healthy patterns in my precious relationships with people, my relationship with myself and with God? I do feel like sometimes in the work that both of us do, sometimes we could get the impression that we're always looking for the negative to fix.
Yeah, no,
It's
yeah.
really not true. Like even in whether it's the therapy office or whether I'm consulting, we are absolutely looking to maximize people's healthy patterns.
Yes, yes. No, I think that's a really good point that um, we tend to think that we even tend to see patterns as negative, and
Yeah.
that even that's a shift for some people. That if we're stuck only looking at the negative, to even ask the question, what are the patterns of health that you're experiencing in this group or in your relationship or in your marriage? That it that it's true that even the realization that we do have some healthy patterns
Mm.
can give us something to attach to and be helpful to move toward rather than the same old of the unhealthy. There is a
Yeah.
positive same old, isn't there?
I think that's right. And, my most recent book, The Expectation Gap, it really hits hard on our well being with God. And I think this is also a really helpful tool for our audience because I think most Christians really do feel like we should be so much further along in our faith than we are. So we focus so quickly on what we're not doing. But even with your relationship with God, you could really relax into God's presence by paying attention to, well, what are my rhythms and what are my healthy patterns with God rather than always focusing on, I really should have Nehemiah memorized by now, some of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I really like that. I think even the candle has become a pattern
right,
most mornings for me to
right.
start that way. Um, and then even as we look at, yeah, patterns with our kids, even how we're going to look at them or, um, yeah, it's a really good one to think about.
Yeah. The other thing I loved about Kathleen, and this is the second time I've had her on my podcast, she has a level of playfulness and joy that just really come through.
Mhm.
And I think that's another good word based on Kathleen's interview is we can get so earnest in all of these works, but really playfulness is an incredible power tool to help you manage your reactivity and your coping.
Yeah, it's a must, isn't it?
I think so.
Yeah, it keeps us youthful. Yeah, it keeps us bewildered if we're going to go
Yeah.
back to even, or opens us up to bewilderness and to hope. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Our third guest was Eugene Cho. I love this interview. I love Eugene and what he said. The thing that I know we both took a lot away from it. I got off that call thinking, man, I don't know anybody doing policy work in DC. My world feels very disconnected from like federal policy work. And here's Eugene Cho chipping away at global hunger. That struck me.
Well, and then he even said, most people look at when policy has been signed or where something has been made legal or illegal,
Yeah.
right? For the freedom of someone else, but that we don't see the years of advocacy, of fundraising, of discussion that has gone into creating the policies. And it's just another area where I don't think of the people that are investing their life and their resources to that level. But absolutely, that's what's needed for the larger change. So, yeah, it was really eye opening. And also for someone to have that giftedness and then to step in, because I think policy making, you could use that gift in a lot of different ways. But then he has that gift and then stewarding that for the kingdom. And then I feel like that was his challenge is what is the giftedness that God has given you and what needs has he presented you with that are right before you that you could step into in a more engaged way. That's really important to think about.
Yeah, it definitely brings up President Trump's executive orders and all of the massive rapid change that he's bringing.
Mhm.
And here we have Eugene Cho, who can point to lives saved based on his policy work, and
Yeah.
therefore lives lost based on the sweep of a pen. And
Yes.
I think what I'm convicted by is okay, what can I do as a follower of Jesus? I love that reminder of, okay, look around, where is there need? And then maybe even, okay, well, how can I go one part, not just in my immediate vicinity, but what's kind of my next thing? The other thing he really brought up was the idea of focusing on one need and cheerleading others. We both really love that.
Yeah. Yeah. And it comes back to why do we get stuck in advocacy? It's like you said, it feels too big.
Yeah.
And in the moment, we can feel overwhelmed and feel like, what can one person do? Yeah, but he laid the second level out is, what are you going to engage with personally? And then beyond, more in the local scope that could have further reach. And then look at your ability to encourage and cheerlead. And who are the people who are doing bigger work, or I don't want to say bigger, but maybe has their work is more, what's the word I'm looking for?
like global in scope. I
Yeah,
mean,
the scope. Yeah,
mhm.
that the scope has more of a global impact. And how can you steward your time to encourage, or how can you be intentional about it in conversations with the people in your life around that? And that's a way also to be a part of the impact.
Yeah. Some of our personal heroes, some of them are known publicly. Maybe they're authors and speakers, and some of them are not really known that publicly.
Mhm.
But what they have in common is how they have focused on one particular social challenge
Yes.
and spent decades chipping away at it. But then I'm thinking about people like our friends Brian and Julie and the work they do, Christine and Nick Kane. But they're fitting what Eugene's saying. They really do encourage and cheerlead others in other avenues.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that if we're all doing that, we start to detangle the web and to increase the work that's being done. That was a really good challenge. I love to encourage people. And what's true is sometimes I wait for the people to present themselves to me. And what I can do is be intentional about where I want to place my encouragement and steward that too.
Yeah. Yeah. Our fourth guest was Steve Carter. We both love Steve. I've chatted to him a couple of times on my podcast. He also has a phenomenal podcast. He's one of our favorite interviewers. But he had written a book called Grieve, Breathe, Receive. And what I appreciated about it is obviously it's a book on grief. I think when we think grief, we think death. But of course, grief is broader than that. It's any loss. But you've also mentioned, I've learned this from you, that grief is also like change at a pace you can't process. Rapid change
Yeah.
can generate grief. It's harrowing to hear him at his 38th birthday and then track the several years and everything he lost, his reputation, his vocation, his geography. They moved out of state. He had some death in his life of people very precious to him. It was like grief upon grief upon grief. I think that's why I really appreciate Steve is he is, as the Bible would call it, like well acquainted with grief, but almost like in every facet you can experience it. I find him to be just a really helpful guide for people who are grieving. But I've learned a lot from you where you've actually helped people understand maybe the difference between grief and depression, or even there's some overlap, obviously. But like you've actually helped people to figure out, am I heavily in grief or am I depressed? How do I know?
Yeah. I mean, it's a really good question. It's also really nuanced. But I have had really multiple people want to know if they're, or just comment that they feel like they're in depression or spiraling down. Um, and what's interesting is the more we talk to them and see there is a motivation, there is a get up and do, um, there is a moving toward things. And that usually depression falls in the hypo arousal of the nervous system, which is all motivated by shutting down and just not moving. Um, and so when we look at people that it's like, what is that confusion when you're feeling numb or feeling like a lack of purpose, but you're not like not moving, you're still really moving.
Yeah.
And there's a desire to figure things out. And usually there's quite a bit of layered grief. The more I talk to people, and it's true when I look at my own life too,
Yeah.
that that when we get to that point, there are a variety of different losses or changes that have overlapped that have not yet been processed and can keep us stuck. And so it has some feelings of depression, may not be depression itself, but in that there is an invitation to look at what's been lost and to feel what you're feeling and to even have a good friend or spiritual director, anybody that can ask you tough questions and create a space to turn toward the loss and to grieve.
Yeah. So obviously, this is a generalization. It's not always accurate, but you're saying generally, depression makes you want to move less. But if you are still fairly active and able to face the world and feel like you have enough energy, it may not be depression. It may be grief. That
That's
might
what
be
I'm
something
saying.
to explore. The other thing I've noticed as well, like when my mum was dying, I went into chaplain mode. It was really weird.
Mm.
Because I was in the room as she was taking her last breaths. And I could even tell, I'm like, why am I counting her breaths? I used to do that as a chaplain.
Mm.
And it was kind of a way to be present without being invasive to other family members. You can just count the person's breaths. You're getting an idea of how much longer they have.
Mm.
There I am in the room with my dad, my sister, my own mother.
Mm.
And I realized, oh, this is how I'm coping. Like,
Counting the
yeah, I'm just
breaths.
going, but I was very active. I had all the energy I needed,
Mhm.
but it was kind of a survival grief technique.
Mhm.
But then with somebody with depression, it feels like there's not enough energy available. They almost feel like they can't reach for the energy they need. Does that
Mhm.
sound right? And so
Mhm.
therefore they're always at a deficit.
Yeah, the depression itself, and it again, it's nuanced, right? Like
Yeah.
none of this is black and white. But depression itself is going to begin to shut down your energy as well. And that in grief, there is depressive symptoms where you feel numb, and sometimes there's a sadness, sometimes there's deep anger there that is also mixed with sadness and confusion. Sometimes there's a disorientation, sometimes a cynicism that has helped us through, but then is beginning to take over and can contribute to some just more disorientation or doubt or but there's so many things in it that are more nuanced than just saying it's depression, and it usually can untangle and unfold as we allow ourselves to grieve.
Okay. It also feels like for those in the midst of grief, it's kind of like a weather pattern. Like you don't get to
Mhm.
decide what kind of weather it's
It
going to be
comes your
today.
way.
Yeah. The weather shows up in, unwelcome. And then you don't
Yes.
always know how long is it going to
I
rain? And
know.
then sometimes it's like, oh, that's not rain. That's a tornado. Like grief can come and
Yeah.
really take you off your feet as well.
Yeah. I would say it's like when we feel really, really sick, we will call off work,
Yeah.
right? And if you're listening to someone or if you're listening to this and you realize, yeah, I think some of that might be right under the surface and is bubbling up, you have permission to take a sick day if you can, or to take time if you can, just like you would if you were medically not well. That this can be a way that you can pour into a well self.
Okay. All right. So to summarize the last four guests, Zach Meerkrebs, we have bewilderment. We have the intentional move to not get in the way, like somehow be part of what God's doing without getting in the way of it. That was really something. Kathleen Smith, we had this amazing definition of get in the relationship, but don't get wrapped up in the negative patterns of the relationships. And that every one of us can pay attention to the positive and the negative patterns in all our relationships because it's being human, including our relationship with ourselves. We have Eugene Cho, who is encouraging us to find a broken place and serve it, find a cause, and also at the same time cheerlead others who are serving other causes. And then we have Steve Carter, who really helped us understand what grief looks like and the disorientation of it. And just, I mean, his book title, I think, says it all: Grieve, Breathe, Receive. This was a great little run of guests we
This
had.
really was.
Yeah.
And what's true is you might find a next step within any one of these, right? It's going to be hard to do all,
Yeah.
but within any one of these could be helpful.
Okay. So once in a while, we will pause the guest. We'll pop back on and kind of recap the guest, maybe teach some tools ourselves. I have the great kind of insight that I've already recorded some of these upcoming guests.
Yeah. You're
Not going to
looking
lie.
forward to what's
I'm really
next.
excited
Yeah.
about it. Okay. Thanks for joining us on Being Human today.
See you next time.